September 11th, 2001. A day no one in America or the world will ever forget. As mighty towers of glass and steel toppled, and the center of America's military power burned, the world as we know it changed forever. People everywhere were left with questions that, at the time, seemed unanswerable. Who was behind the attacks? Why were innocent people targeted? And how could this have happened in America? In the wake of the attacks, answers to these questions would slowly emerge. But perhaps more importantly, a spiritual awakening swept the country the likes of which hadn't been seen in more than a century. People were turning to God for comfort, and these people had questions of their own. If God is a loving God, how could he have allowed this to happen? Why didn't God do anything to stop this terrible evil? In short, where was God on September 11th, 2001? On that beautiful Tuesday morning, the same question would undoubtedly go through the minds of many of the people on board United Airlines Flight 93. The 757 made its way west toward San Francisco, just as it had so many times before. 37 passengers and 7 crew members were on board. On any other day, Flight 93 would have made it to the coast within a few hours. But this day would be different. The United 757 was one of 4 commercial aircraft hijacked by terrorists and used as weapons of unimaginable destruction. In the heat of the moment, the innocent passengers and crew on board, ordinary people from all walks of life, will be faced with a terrible choice, and they'll have very little time in which to make it. Are they willing to risk their lives in order to fight back against an evil new enemy? The answer is a resounding yes.
We've got a plan.
But what really happened on board Flight 93? How did the passengers and crew come to a decision that would ultimately cost them their lives?
Let's roll.
Go, you guys. Go.
And what about those of us who were left behind? Can the story of Flight 93 help us answer the difficult spiritual questions that came out of that tragic day? Your host for this program is an ordained minister and the president of a national broadcast and cable television group. Here is Jerry Rose.
Among the many heroic stories that emerged out of the September 11th tragedy, the story of Flight 93 is unique. Some have even gone as far as to call it the first strike in the war on terror. And it was not made by a highly trained military unit, but by ordinary, unarmed citizens who, well, turned out not to be so ordinary after all. In the skies above Pennsylvania, the people on board the hijacked plane put into effect a plan that would spare the lives of countless people on the ground and bring the terrorists' best-laid plans to nothing. Forced into a life and death situation, the people on board Flight 93 became what all of us would hope to be: courageous, unflinching, and willing to fight back so that others might live. It's a story that in many ways exemplifies the teachings of Jesus in the Scriptures.
Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends.
As it turns out, quite a few of the people who were on board that plane were people of deep personal faith. When the plane crashed, the family members they left behind were left to face some of the most difficult questions life has to offer. But as you'll see, their faith has carried them through. Join us as we examine the amazing depth of God's love and bring to light the inspiring and truly heroic stories of Flight 93. Let me just give you a little bit of the update. Anybody in the world right now knows what's going on, a lot about what's going on. But so far, the FBI have said that there are 4 hijackings today in America. United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in western Pennsylvania. That flight was from Newark to San Francisco. And if you know someone on that flight... On the morning of September 11, 2001, people around the world were glued to their television sets as images of the terrorist attacks unfolded before our eyes. When my colleagues and I broadcast the update that you just saw, the details were still trickling in. How many people had been lost? Were more attacks on the way? And what about United Flight 93? Out of the 4 hijacked jets, why was it the only one that crashed into a rural area? And what had become of the people on board? Only hours before, the idea of such a tragedy would have been unthinkable. But this was September 11th, the day the world changed forever.
Good morning, how are you? Hi, good morning.
By just after 9 in the morning, it seems almost all of America knew about the terrorist attacks against the World Trade Center towers, all except the passengers and crew of Flight 93. In fact, for the first 46 minutes of the flight, Captain Jason Dahl and First Officer Leroy Homer Jr. had enjoyed a routine flight.
The aircraft reaches cruise altitude. For all intents and purposes, weather is not a factor. It's a nice, smooth ride. Jason and Leroy are sitting back for a nice little 4-hour flight to San Francisco. And at 9:23 in the morning, they get a text message from United Dispatch that says, "Beware cockpit intrusion. 2 aircraft hit World Trade Center." We know specifically that Jason got that message because 2 minutes later, Jason sends a message that says, "Please confirm last message, Jason." The timeline on this is very tight. You have a 9:23 message Jason receives. You've got a Jason respond message at 9:26. The 9/11 Commission says takeover occurred at 28 after. So everything happens in 3 to 4 minutes.
We have a bomb! Stay calm! We take control of the plane!
One of the most unfortunate aspects as far as gathering information about Flight 93 is that the cockpit voice recorder is on a continuous 30-minute loop. That means that once you get past 30 minutes, you start taping over yourself again and you lose the previous information. At the time of takeover, it's beyond that 30-minute loop by the time we have impact in Shanksville. So we lose that information. However, we do have other sources of information. We have Cleveland Air Traffic Control Center, which recorded transmissions from Flight 93 and also has some telemetry as far as altitude changes and heading changes from Flight 93.
Based on this crucial recording, Sandy Dahl, the wife of Captain Jason Dahl and a former flight attendant herself, has developed a theory on what may have happened next.
I believe that Leroy Homer had left the cockpit to check out what was going on in the back. I think that maybe there was a commotion. He got up and went back to see what was going on, I think.
Anybody coming in on Jason at this time has got a pretty good shot at him. Jason would be virtually defenseless. Did he get his throat slit at this particular moment? Did he just get beat up? We don't necessarily know, but we have strong evidence that he wasn't outright killed at that moment. What we've gleaned from Air Traffic Control Cleveland Center is that somebody, and it's most definitely Jason, has keyed the mic while he's being attacked. We get a mayday out, one mayday, and we also get 3 other messages. Hey, get out of here. Hey, get out of here. And then a few seconds later, we get a very subdued, perhaps a man in pain, saying, get out of here.
There was no evidence that he ever left the cockpit. I believe he was mortally wounded or very wounded in the very beginning. I don't believe he was dead yet, though. I have reason to believe that he was alive for a while.
With the terrorists now in control of the cockpit, the nightmare for the passengers and crew of Flight 93 had just begun. On the ground, family members, friends, and even total strangers would be drawn into the drama.
Tom was seated in first class. He flew all the time and was often given first class upgrades because he was a million-miler on United Airlines.
As the chief operating officer of Thoratec, a company that manufactures life-saving medical equipment, Tom Burnett was a man who knew how to think on his feet. More importantly, he was a man of deep convictions who was not afraid to take a stand.
Not long after we were married, Tom taught me a toast. He would raise his glass into the air and he would say, Live every day as if it were your last, for surely one day you will be right. I think Tom took that to heart. He lived every day with integrity, getting up in the morning and knowing that the face he saw in the mirror had nothing to be ashamed of. He lived it with respect for others and with truth. And I think after Flight 93, we know he lived it with valor and courage.
As the drama on board Flight 93 unfolded, Tom Burnett's strong faith and unquestionable character would serve him well. What's more, over the course of the next half hour, he would make 4 phone calls to his wife, Dina, and would prove to be a vital source of information, both for people on the ground as well as for his fellow passengers on the plane.
The first phone call came when I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast for our 3 children. Tom told me that the flight was being hijacked, that they were trying to get into the cockpit. He told me that they had already knifed a guy. He did indicate that it was a passenger they had knifed. He asked me to call the authorities and gave me the flight information, and then he hung up. After the first phone call, I began thumbing through the phone book trying to figure out who to call in the event of a hijacking. I was stunned and terrified, and the children were reaching for the phone wanting to talk to their dad, wondering why he had not said good morning to them. I told them that he would speak to them later.
The captain, please sit down and keep remaining sitting. We have a bomb aboard. So, stand.
At 9:32, Ziad Jarrah, the head hijacker, is obviously sitting in one of the pilot's seats, and he goes to the communication panel and he thinks he's hit the PA button because he has an important announcement that he wants to make to the passengers. He wants to announce that there's bombs on the airplane and that he is now the captain of the airplane. But Jarrah hits transmit 1 and sends a message to Air Route Traffic Control Cleveland Center and any other airplane in the area that's on that frequency, and that's the message they receive, giving Cleveland Center a hint as to what has happened on Flight 93.
The passengers and remaining crew members of Flight 93 probably never heard the hijacker's announcement, yet they knew very well that something was terribly wrong. Lisa Jefferson, a customer service supervisor with GTE Verizon, took a phone call from one of the passengers on board Flight 93, who also happened to be a believer. His name, Todd Beamer.
He told me that there were 3 people that had taken over the plane, 2 with knives and 1 with a bomb strapped around his waist with a red belt. The 2 with the knives had locked themselves into the cockpit. They had ordered everyone to sit down because the flight attendants were standing. One just happened to sit next to him.
According to Todd Beamer, the hijacker then closed the curtain that separates the first 6 rows of the plane from the rear cabin. Beamer tells Lisa Jefferson that he can't see exactly what's going on, but it appears that there are 2 people lying on the floor in the first-class cabin. He's not sure if they're dead or alive. Faced with the prospects of dangerous hijackers and possibly a bomb on board, the passengers and crew members might have chosen the safe route. In fact, airline procedure would have told them to comply with the hijacker's request to remain seated and keep quiet.
Prior to September 11th, flight crews, pilots and flight attendants, were trained to offer passive resistance. Not necessarily compliance, but we would try to de-escalate the threat. Imagine your worst nightmare. You're a flight attendant on Flight 93. It's got to be beyond anything you've ever been trained for. You don't know if the pilots are dead. You know probably that one of your fellow flight attendants has been killed. You're responsible for all of the passengers. Some of them are injured. You're trying to help them. A couple of the flight attendants we know are on the phone. However, they've been trained for passive resistance. Now they have to get active. They have to get violent, but they have to be careful not to be eliminated because the passengers need the flight attendants.
You were told to survive before. And that was assuming that your hijacker wanted to survive as well. Now you can't assume that. Survival now will be taking the airplane back.
The passengers and remaining crew members on board Flight 93 were in an impossible situation. Official procedure told them to stay in their seats and cooperate. Instead, they chose to do just the opposite, knowing full well their lives were at stake. No doubt, quite a few prayers were said as the people of Flight 93 tried to get a handle on their desperate situation. But while they were dealing with a terrorist in the sky, their friends and family on the ground were facing their own terror. What would become of the people they loved most in the world? And where was God in the midst of this nightmare? The more I learned, the more I want it to be a dream, a nightmare that I can wake up from, shower, shave, brush my teeth, and walk away from, but I can't. It really happened, and we all have to face that reality. And as I'm facing that reality, I remember that over 5,000 people woke up on Tuesday morning, showered, got dressed, had a hurried breakfast, kissed the family goodbye with a promise to see them in the afternoon, and never returned. How many were lost in the terrorist attacks of September 11th? In the hours and days after the tragedy unfolded, accurate information was hard to come by. We know now that the original estimates of some 5,000 people killed was far too high. But even as the real number started taking shape, there was little solace to be found. Our world had changed forever. And the people who lost family members, including those who were on board the hijacked planes, would never be the same. Cheryl McGinnis knows this reality all too well. On September 11th, her husband Tom McGinnis left their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and reported to work at Boston's Logan Airport. Later that morning, Cheryl would learn that her husband had been the co-pilot of American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane to crash into the World Trade Center. In an instant, her strong faith in God was put to the test in a way it had never been before. Where was God in the midst of all of this unbelievable tragedy? The most difficult questions any Christian can face in the course of a lifetime came crowding in on Cheryl in a matter of minutes, just as it did for the families of those lost on Flight 93. In her book, Beauty Beyond the Ashes, Cheryl tells us of the heartbreaking, difficult, but ultimately uplifting journey she began on that day of days.
Well, September 11th is a day that I will never forget. I had just come home from driving my children to school, and I put my keys on the countertop and went out to sit on my back porch, and I had just finished praying when my phone rang, and that's when the nightmare began. And it was just a horrible, horrible time of waiting and watching the images on television, waiting until the chief pilot from American Airlines came to my house and gave me the official word that Flight 11 had not only been hijacked, but had been deliberately flown into the World Trade Center, and there were no survivors.
Where was God in the midst of 9/11? I think that's an entirely fair question for people to ask. What I don't think is a fair question is for people to say there was no God because of 9/11. And here's what I mean by that. When we see this thing that happened and we see the dramatic events that took place and unfolded, something deep inside of us was moved. We were moved because this was a tremendous tragedy. Now my question is, if there is no God, what makes this a tragedy? A tragedy is a profound evil. How can there be profound evil in the world if there is no profound good? Now that needs an explanation. And anybody who wants to address this question of what happened on 9/11 has to have a worldview that is robust enough to be able to make sense of that. Christianity can do that.
We were celebrating our 18th wedding anniversary, and Tom had told me a very sad story of a Navy friend of his who had lost his wife suddenly. And I looked at Tom and I said, Tom, if that ever happened to me, I just could not live here without you. I couldn't do it. And he took my hand and he held my hand and he said, Cheryl, if anything ever happens to me, you must trust God. Must trust God and allow people to love you and come into your life to help you. And 3 weeks later, Tom was called home.
On the morning of September 11th, in the living room of her New Hampshire home, Cheryl McGinnis would begin the most difficult journey of her life, a journey that Dina Burnett would soon share. She had received one phone call from her husband on board Flight 93, and now she was desperate to find something, anything that she could do to help him. As the drama on board Flight 93 unfolded, Tom Burnett found himself surrounded by an unusual mix of people, a group whose collective skills and abilities made it almost seem as if they'd been hand-chosen to be on this particular flight. There was Jeremy Glick, a 6'1", 220-pound man who just happened to be a former NCAA judo champion. And joining Glick in the rear cabin of Flight 93 was Louis Nackey, better known to his family members as Joey.
He had a very big heart. It's kind of hard to explain. Here's a guy that would, get you in a headlock, hug you as hard as he can. And to outside, it looks like he's roughhousing with you, but up close, he'd be whispering how he loves you in your ear, so only you would hear it. That's a side most people didn't get to see of him. Family was his number one priority, and then everything else followed suit after that. He was a great athlete. A phenomenal baseball player. Early on, at 13, 14 years old, he started weightlifting. Followed through to his entire life. It's just that I'm very fortunate to have an older brother like him. I always wanted to, growing up, always wanted to be like him.
With a weightlifter's physique and Superman logo tattooed on his arm, investigators believe that Nackey may have also played a pivotal role in the revolt that was to come. Another likely participant was Richard Guadagno. As manager of a national wildlife refuge in Northern California, Guadagno was a federal law enforcement officer who received the same kind of training in hand-to-hand combat that's required of federal drug enforcement and border patrol agents.
He was a firm believer in the law, a very, very firm believer in the law. I remember picking him up at the airport. On the ride home, I told him I had just received a traffic ticket, and of course it was not deserved, as everyone who gets it. But I did mouth off a little bit to the police officer, and Richard said, "Well, you deserved it, and just pay the ticket." And I've got to say, there wasn't much conversation the rest of the trip home. That was our Richard.
Old friends Bill Cashman and Joe Driscoll added something to the mix as well. Traveling together for a hiking trip in Yosemite National Park, Cashman was a former paratrooper with the 101st Airborne and an ex-ironworker who helped in the construction of the World Trade Center. His friend Joe Driscoll served in the Navy during the Korean War and took pride in his athleticism. Even at the age of 70, he competed as a racewalker and set out on strenuous wilderness hikes without even hesitating. There was even a certified emergency medical technician on board, Lauren Grancolis. Always one to keep her cool, Grancolis had a note pinned to a refrigerator door that captured her philosophy toward life. It read, "Get busy living or get busy dying." One of the oldest people on the plane, Hilda Marson, was not one to shy away from conflict either. While living in New York City, she chased a would-be burglar out of her home with a billy club. And United flight attendant Cece Lyles had once worn a very different uniform, that of a police officer and detective on the mean streets of Fort Pierce, Florida.
Cece was a detective. She did undercover dressing up as a prostitute to get Johns and things of that nature. Well, she was fair. But if you was one of those guys that was, as we call them, repeat offenders and multiple offenders, and you see them on a constant basis, then she was very firm, and you know that she was firm. She was a hard charger.
As Cece Lyles and the other flight attendants on board Flight 93 prepared to close the doors for takeoff, passenger Mark Bingham would have inevitably drawn their attention.
He was the last person to board because he was so late getting to the airport. I'm afraid he's inherited his mom's trait for being tardy. He He rushed through security, and I'm sure it went very fast for him. I think they even opened the door for him again. Mark was a pretty wonderful kid. He grew from being a gangly and self-conscious little boy to a sturdy and very self-confident young man. I credit a lot of that to his being accepted on the Los Gatos High School rugby team, and I could see him just blossom into a real competitor. Something terrific happened to him when he was in high school playing rugby on a tour down there in Fiji and New Zealand, and for some reason he got banned from the entire nation of New Zealand, and it had something to do with a fracas in the airport. I suppose I shouldn't want to know. Anyway, he was a good kid. He was really soft-tempered, sweet, but he was no one to back away from a fight.
When the hijacking began, Mark Bingham was seated in the forward cabin of Flight 93, directly across the aisle from Tom Burnett. On September 11th, Tom Burnett's intellect and strength of character undoubtedly came into play. He had a genius-level IQ, and in his career as a business executive, he became an expert at forming strategies and putting them into effect quickly.
Tom called for a second time. He then told me that the hijackers were in the cockpit. I told him that 2 planes had hit the World Trade Center, that there were other hijackings taking place up and down the East Coast. He was very concerned, began asking questions. He wanted to know who was involved, how many planes, how many people, what did they want, where were they going, what was going on. And I just answered his questions as best I could from the television. I wanted to do more and really didn't know how to help him. And I know that he was able to figure it out much sooner than I was. He made the statement, "Oh my God, this is a suicide mission."
The awful realization of what lay in store began to sink into Dina's heart. But in a strange way, it was something God had prepared her for since before she and Tom had even married.
When Tom proposed to me, I, of course, was very excited. But I also remember thinking that I really needed to be careful about the answer that I gave. I just had a feeling that Tom was going to die young. And I really believed that it was God's way of just giving me a glimpse of what was going to occur in some small way. It was a grace-filled moment in which he said, "You really need to think about whether or not you can do this." I shared the thoughts with my mom. I even went so far as to tell her that he would be in a plane crash. And I didn't know why I was telling her those things. I just believe it was grace that was preparing me for the role we would have to play.
But how do we deal with a loss as great as the one that occurred on September 11th? It's one of life's most difficult questions, and something that we all must confront sooner or later, whether it's through a divorce, debilitating disease, or the death of a spouse, parent, or a child.
We of all people should understand that God has not guaranteed us immunity from pain and suffering in this world. I have a friend once who said, Jesus is not the bridge over troubled waters, but He'll pull you through the troubled waters if you can stand the tow.
It's a time and a place, and you know, God knows everything. He sees all, He knows all, He knows what's going to happen. You know, He just finds some way to put certain people in places to comfort us. His love's still there, and that's what helps us through.
Since September 11th, people like Dina Burnett, Lauren Lyles, Cheryl McGinnis, and others have had their faith in God tested to the limit as they've grappled with the most difficult question of all: why? However, as they've continued to put their faith in Him, they've discovered God is true to His promises and their faith has helped them find answers in His consistent love and care.
God has brought me through the worst storm of my life, and He has brought me to a place where I can honestly say that I have joy in my heart. I can honestly say that, and it feels so good. I feel like I've been released of my mourning period, and I feel like that I can now go forward even more into all that God has for me. And that was just recently, after 4 years. That just recently happened to me.
I relied heavily on my faith. I think I must have prayed every minute of every day in some way, in some form. Jesus help me.
On the morning of September 11th, Tom Burnett had made 2 calls to his wife Dina within minutes of each other. Then at 9:37 a.m., the terrorists struck again as American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon.
I saw where a third plane had hit. This one had been flown into the Pentagon, and I was so afraid that it was Tom's plane. I just sat there staring at the television and trying to make myself stop crying. And I realized I was frightening my children. They came over and they started crying, "Mommy, what's wrong? Is that Dad's plane?" And just then the phone rang. It was Tom's third phone call. And I just immediately, I screamed into the phone. I said, "Tom, you're okay." I thought he had survived the plane crash. And he said, "No, I'm not." So I told him then that another plane had hit the Pentagon. He mentioned at one point, he said, "You know, if they're going to crash this plane, we're going to have to do something."
In Romans chapter 12, the Apostle Paul tells us, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." With courage and tremendous faith, people like Tom Burnett, Todd Beamer, C.C. Lyles, and so many others came together on board Flight 93 to do just that. Is it possible these words were going through their minds as they formed their battle plan? In the days after the crash of Flight 93, investigators learned of even more phone calls that came from the courageous passengers and crew on board the hijacked jet. What crucial details did these phone calls reveal? Not only about the plan of revolt, but about the power of faith in those final moments. God is not to blame for this horrendous act of terrorism. There's sin in the world, and sin destroys. I think the Sun-Times headline said it all. God help us. God wants to help us, and He will, as we sincerely call on Him in this time of desperate need in America. September 11th will be remembered by a generation of Americans as our darkest hour. Across America and around the world, people prayed for comfort, peace, healing, and for those who lost their lives, many of whom became our heroes. There were many examples of heroism that day as the people on board Flight 93 risked their lives to alter a desperate situation. But few people realized just how much worse it might have been were it not for the actions of this amazing group. Just how high a price might we have had to pay? And were the people on board Flight 93 the only thing standing in the way of an even greater disaster? And what of the U.S. military's reaction to the hijacking?
When the planes were seized that morning, it took a long time for NORAD to get active. The Federal Aviation Administration officials did not contact NORAD immediately, and finally 2 sets of fighter planes were scrambled from bases in Massachusetts and Virginia. NORAD fighter jets had a hard time even finding their targets, and they were late anyway. They did not have a clue that Flight 93 had been hijacked until it had already crashed in the countryside of Pennsylvania. By the time Vice President Cheney gave the authorization to NORAD to shoot down Flight 93, it was 10:20 in the morning. That was 17 minutes after the plane crashed in Pennsylvania. The importance of this? Flight 93 was only about 15 minutes from its intended target, probably the U.S. Capitol, and the NORAD fighter jets would have been too late. So without those heroes aboard Flight 93, the hijackers might have completed their mission.
The government, through the 9/11 Commission report, believes strongly that either the White House or the United States Capitol was indeed the target for Flight 93. However, having attended the guilty plea in federal district court of Zacarias Moussaoui, the only conspirator tried in the United States, when he acknowledged he was part of a conspiracy, he acknowledged that he was targeting the White House in another plane that was never hijacked. Therefore, based on his admissions in federal court, based on the fact that the Pentagon flight crash, American Flight 77, was observed flying up the Capitol Mall, I personally believe that the United States Capitol was the intended target. I believe that American 77 that ultimately crashed in the Pentagon was flying up the mall to gloat, to see what they assumed would have already been a burning United States Capitol. But for the diversion and the delays with Flight 93, it never happened. And I think the eerie message that would have been sent to the world on 9/11, had the United States Capitol been in flames, the ultimate icon of the United States and indeed democracy for the free world, 9/11 would have been a far more darker day, something I think most people haven't thought about.
If Flight 93 had reached its target, the government of the United States would have sustained an unimaginable blow. What effect would this have had on the nation and the world? Thanks to the passengers and crew of Flight 93, that awful question would not have to be answered.
During the fourth phone call, he was insistent that they were going to do something. They were going to take the plane back. And the flight attendant in me immediately spoke up and said, "No, sit down, be still, be quiet, don't draw attention to yourself." And of course I was screaming this into the phone, and he yelled back. He said, "No, Dina, no. If they're going to crash this plane, we're going to do something." And I asked him what else I could do. He said, "Pray, Dina. Just pray." I said, "I am." I know that he didn't want me to be afraid. And I tried really hard not to be. I told him I loved him. He said, "Don't worry. We're going to do something." And he just left the impression that everything was going to be okay and that he'd be home for dinner. And I believed that.
New Jersey software executive Todd Beamer had a family he wanted to get home to as well. Beamer had attempted to call his wife from United Flight 93. For some reason, the call did not go through, and he was connected to an airphone operator on the ground, Lisa Jefferson. Not long after the call began, the plane made an erratic and sharp turn to the north, causing the husband and father of two young boys to make a special request.
He wanted me to recite the Lord's Prayer with him, and he did. He recited the Lord's Prayer from start to finish.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, and will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
The battle for Flight 93 was about to begin. And like so many men and women of the past who fought and died for their country, their courage inspired a nation.
I remember Tom talking about a charge at Gettysburg. They wrote notes to their wives and their loved ones and tacked them to the trees, and they marched forward as they were told to do. knowing they were going to die. I remember Tom sharing that story with me and his wondering if he would have the courage to do the same, to follow orders, to do what had to be done. I've thought so many times that I hope before he died, he realized that he had that same courage.
Less than 30 minutes after Flight 93 was hijacked, the passengers and crew made their move. From his phone call to GTE operator Lisa Jefferson, we know that Todd Beamer was among them and that his faith sustained him until the very end.
We're gonna do something. We're talking about jumping the guy with the bomb. No, we're gonna have to go. I'm gonna have to go out on faith.
After that, he had a sign in his voice. He took a deep breath. He was still holding the phone, but he was not talking to me. He was talking to someone else. And I can tell that he had turned away from the phone to talk to someone else. And he said, "You ready? Okay. Let's roll."
Go, you guys. Go, go, come on, come on, go.
What exactly happened in those final heroic moments on Flight 93? Were the passengers and remaining crew members able to enter the cockpit? And did they attempt to regain control of the plane from the hijackers? The cockpit voice recording, which has never been made public, is the only source of information that might hold the key. Only those who have heard the recording can shed light on this question and perhaps help us solve the ultimate mystery of Flight 93. When we return, you'll find out just how much that recording reveals, what it doesn't reveal, and learn why the passengers and crew of Flight 93 have earned the right to be counted among the heroes of that tragic day.
We have a bomb! Stay calm! We take control of the plane!
It's a scenario that's almost too frightening to imagine. Terrorists hijack a plane filled with innocent passengers and crew. Their singular goal? To kill as many people on the ground as possible in an effort to wound America as it's never been wounded before. On the morning of September 11th at 9:57 a.m., the passengers and crew on board Flight 93 had come to this very conclusion. Less than 30 minutes after their plane was hijacked, the people on board had made the most difficult decisions they had ever made. They would fight back, even if it cost them their own lives. What happened next was extraordinary. America's first strike against a new and terrifying enemy began with a group of unarmed civilians in the skies over Pennsylvania. But what actually transpired during those final moments of Flight 93? Did the hijackers make the decision to end the flight themselves? Or did the passengers and crew penetrate the cockpit door and retake control of the plane? Since September 11th, the family members of those on board the doomed flight have pondered these questions time and time again. Other than a handful of official investigators, they're the only ones to have heard the cockpit voice recording that's been recovered from Flight 93. While difficult to interpret, the tape has nonetheless yielded a host of clues that investigators have used to piece together the final moments of Flight 93.
There are those who were directly involved in taking the door, but there were also those involved in either boiling water to throw on the hijackers or giving them moral and spiritual support to ensure the ultimate triumph that occurred. We're not permitted to share with you specifically in detail what occurred in the cockpit on 9/11. However, I can share with you that it was bittersweet in hearing it, and that you heard right up front the sheer agony and misery experienced by some, but you also heard the ongoing triumph and the ultimate success and win of bringing that plane out of the sky.
I think that because of my experience as a flight attendant, as I listened to the cockpit voice recorder, I was able to visualize where different people were on the plane as we heard them speak or move around. You could hear different things going on in the background. You can hear one of the hijackers struggling for his own life, and I believe being killed. I remember after that particular hijacker stopped screaming, I could hear Tom's voice for the first time, and it sounded as if he was right there where that particular hijacker had been standing on the plane, as was at least two other men. You could hear their voices. You couldn't really understand what they were saying. And then you can hear many people, both men and women, trying to make their way into the cockpit with the meal cart. We could also hear them chanting. They were in unison saying, in the cockpit or we'll die. Occasionally you could hear one voice above the others, a male voice, that would say something, and then you'd hear other people repeat it. It sounded as if they were trying to save themselves, trying to save the plane.
According to eyewitnesses who saw Flight 93 as it neared the ground, the plane began to rock violently back and forth. Was this a last-ditch attempt by the hijackers to subdue the passengers by knocking them off their feet? Or could it be that the passengers and crew penetrated the cockpit and was struggling for control of the aircraft?
The last words on the cockpit voice recorder were, "Turn up." And I remember thinking how strange it was that someone would not yell, "Pull up." And I spoke to Kimmy Bevan. She said, "That was my husband, Alan." Said he was from New Zealand. Said you would expect an American to say, "Pull up," but he wasn't an American. He said, "Turn up." And I remember the tears in her eyes, and I've thought so many times, he would never have said that if a hijacker were in the seat. He wouldn't say that to a hijacker. So there must have been one of the passengers or crew members in the seat with their hands on the wheel. They just didn't have enough time.
The heroes of Flight 93 weren't just faces in a news story. They were like you and I, real people, with lives full of love and promise, with jobs and everyday obligations, and with family members who were left behind to grieve and to search for answers to some very difficult questions. Why was this awful tragedy allowed to happen? Why didn't God do something to stop this terrible evil? To put it plainly, where was God on September 11th? These are the questions we've all asked ourselves since the day the world changed. And as much as we would like to find easy answers, there are none. But the Bible never promised us easy answers. In fact, we're told that there will be suffering in this world. But we can also find beauty beyond the ashes. Where was God on September 11th? Well, the answer depends greatly on the prism through which you look at the world. Some who profess not to believe in God see the events of 9/11 as proof he does not exist. Or if he does, that he's certainly not a loving, caring creator. For others, the terrorist attacks led to some unexpected soul-searching about life and about God. Like this gentleman who was interviewed on the streets of San Francisco just days after the tragedy.
This event has made people turn and do some introspection, to make some spiritual contact, whether it is, based with religion and organized religion, or if it's their own, sitting on a beach and looking out over the horizon, contemplating life and their role in it. I think that everybody is grasping now for a new understanding of life and their place in it.
There's no doubt that those who lost a family member in the terrorist attacks did some soul-searching as well. Among them, of course, were people of faith. But for them, the response has been quite different.
I have had many moments of doubt. I doubted whether I would ever feel like a whole person again. I doubted whether I would ever feel the Lord's presence and the deep joy in my heart. But as I have walked in faith and as I have been tested through the fire of September 11th, as I have walked out in faith and endured the grieving, the anguish of separation, and surrendered my life to the Lord, I have learned that there is nothing to fear, that God is with me.
Through the adversity and through everything that I've been through, it helped me become a better father, better man of God, and it just really just helped me to become a better person all around.
I may not have Tom with me, but I know that I'll see him again. And I know that the Holy Spirit is with me, and He's my comforter. And I can go through life now truly living with the joy deep in my soul. And I know that that is from the Lord.
God never promised us life without pain. In fact, in the New Testament book of James, we're told that we will have pain and we will have struggles. But we're also assured of God's presence during those times, that He will never leave us or forsake us, and that these times of difficulty will make us stronger and build our spiritual character.
This is exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to happen to people if the Christian view of the world is correct. In fact, this is why the Scriptures themselves tell us to be on our guard and to be strong and sturdy. I mean, James says this, listen, "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love Him." You see, James anticipates this, and he tells us to be ready for when those times will come. But it's not just for us individually in dealing with those things that come upon us. We have a role also in the world to help other people when those kinds of things happen. You see, God doesn't act in a vacuum. He acts through His people. And when these kind of tragedies come up, that's our call. It's time for us to stand up and for the world to see what it's like to follow Jesus in the tough situations, helping people who desperately need it.
God, in His infinite wisdom, has a plan for all of our lives. In the midst of our struggles and crisis, we may not always see that plan unfolding or understand where God is taking us. But as Christians, we know that God is always with us. And, as Dina Burnett found out, He often provides us with comfort in amazing and miraculous ways.
When Tom first died, one of my thoughts was, what is his experience now? I believe there is a heaven. I believe there is a God. I believe that Tom is with God in heaven. I wanted to know what it must be like to be there. And I wanted to know that he was okay. Not just think that he was okay, but to really know that he was okay. A friend came to me and said that she had one night had a dream. And in that dream, Tom was there. And when she saw him, she said to him, she said, "But Tom, you were so brave." And his response to her was, "I did what I could do." And she said, "But what about Dina and the children?" And he said, "Tell Dina that God will take care of her." Not long after Jennifer shared that with me, I had 3 other people come up to me in different situations at different times, and they were complete strangers to me, and share those same words, that Tom did what he could, and God will take care of you. And by the time the 4th person had told me, I knew that it was Tom's message to me, and it had been delivered.
Several Septembers have passed since that tragic day when so many lives were lost. But for those whose family members were on board Flight 93, the shining example of heroism that their loved ones gave us is as bright as ever.
Good can and must prevail over evil. And indeed, that particular day, a very dark day for most of the world, had a ray of sunshine. That ray of sunshine was that ordinary citizens can stand up and prevail against evil, as they did.
And that's what happened that day. They just, a whole bunch of ordinary people did a lot of wonderful things that day. And I'm proud of each and every one of them.
I stand there often and I look into the hemlock groves that you see off in the distance from the temporary memorial, and I can imagine seeing all 40 of them just walking out of the hemlocks and just brushing themselves off, saying they gave it their best shot, but they couldn't beat us, and here we are today.
This was a group of people who were going about just living their everyday lives, and yet they made a difference that impacted not just the thousands of lives that were saved in the White House, but the entire nation, in knowing that courage and valor and integrity were important in our everyday walk.
If you're worried about who led the charge or who was more important than others, you're very foolish, because it doesn't matter. You know, I think if you looked up the word American in Webster's dictionary, you should see 40 people, and they all were from Flight 93.
Gone, but not forgotten. The heroic actions of every person on Flight 93 are indelibly etched on our minds to serve as a reminder of the goodness that we should all strive for and the frailty of life itself. Our plans can never be so certain as to guarantee us another tomorrow, but there is a promise for the future, and it's one that offers us a glorious hope, and it's found in our relationship with God through His Son, Jesus Christ. In Him, we find that true inner peace that every human being longs for, one that transcends life's highest peaks and its darkest valleys. I'm Jerry Rose. Thanks for joining me.